Yes, my talk is going to be around the use of data and operational research to enhance decision making. Before I go any further, I just want to give a little bit of background about myself. So yes, I'm just Soje. I am an operational researcher by background. Currently a technology business analyst in the financial services, but I've had extensive experience working across Nigeria and also the United Kingdom. I have a consultancy formed, called the Valu8 Consulting, and what we do is, provide decision support services to a range of organizations. So yeah, everything we do is largely driven by data and technology. We also look at strategies and just helping organizations to become either more profitable, streamline processes, become more efficient, basically. Like I said, I've had experience across public sector and private. So what you'll be seeing today from my discussions to you will be is largely informed by my experience across health, across finance, across technology, across aquaculture, agriculture as well. And many of the experiences here will be very valuable to you, regardless of which sector you're playing just now. So I'll leave you with this quote for a start, and why we're here. And I believe we're all here because we want to learn, regardless of what sectors we do play and what level of our professionalism is. But we're here to increase our wisdom. And my hope is that at the end of this discussion, you would be more informed, basically, about data and how it can be used to support decision making. So what I'll be covering today basically is simply around data and data culture. So I'll walk you through the foundations and the basic building blocks around what we mean by data-driven culture, because I've mentioned that quite a lot so far. Walk you through those steps, and at the end of the day, we would also bring in together the combination of how data and operational research can be combined to inform decision making. And then I'll use, time permitting, hopefully the last 15 minutes before we go into questions, I'll try to bring to life using a real life example of how data and operational research have been applied to inform a policy-making decision in Nigeria. So it's not going to be an example from elsewhere, but it's going to be an example that's very pertinent to our immediate environment, because as I can see from the call, majority of us have our relationship or ties to the continent of Africa, and in Nigeria in particular. There's also going to be a little bit of an engagement. I'll come up with a poll shortly on the screen, which would just allow you to bring to life, some of the things that I'll be talking about. So let's start. What does it mean to be data-driven? We hear about data quite a lot in the conversations, in the context, on the news. In some ways, it sometimes appears like a jargon, right? But what exactly do we mean by being data-driven, right? So what you can see on the screen here are just core attributes. So if any of these attributes relates to you or your organization or who you work for, or if it's a small business, then I believe you can consider yourself to be data-driven. So you have to be informed by culture. You have to be literate in data. And when we say data, the ecosystem is quite wide. And decision-making, do you make decisions? Are your decisions about hiring, about providing services, goods and services, providing stock, deliveries? Those are decisions that you have to make across some form of service delivery, right? And do you use technology to drive, your processes or any decision making that you do? So we are using Zoom right now. We're having a conversation, so that's a technology. It's enabling the conversation we're having. Are you using computers? Are you using software? If you're an architect, make designs, or if you are in construction, to get some cost estimates, for example. So these are attributes of data-driven organizations. But again, To be data-driven means goes beyond just for this four attributes. So I'll try to break them down individually so that we can get a full picture of what we mean by data-driven organizations, and also being an organization that leverages data to make decisions. So I'll start from the basics. So this is not like your computer 101, but we talk about data. So what exactly is data? If you recall, it's been bandied around, that data is a new oil, right? In some way, it seemed to project the notion that data, brings more wealth, or data, increases value, or brings some serious returns on investment to you as an organization or individual. Well, that's partially right. But let's look at data as an asset, right? And that data in itself, can also be structured in two ways. So you can see data being structured could be, it could be sales inventory. It could be maybe the list of your customers. If you manage patients, it could be the list of your patients by demographics. It could also be list of your clients. Or if you're in sports, it could be data. For example, I'll use a recent example. I know we're all hurt by the performance of the Super Eagles, but if you want to start asking questions on how to improve, then we may say, let's look for data that tells us the performance of the Super Eagles by how they qualified for the World Cup over the last 20 years, over the last 10 years. I'm sure that data is there. You can pull it together. But you can also have data which is unstructured. So it could be customer feedback, it could be emails, complaints from customers, or it could be information on your website. So data can appear in various forms, right? So, but data on itself is an asset, but it can be transformed into making decisions, until you get to that step. In itself, it sits as an asset. It will sit as an idle asset until it starts to work for you. So what we'll be hearing today is how to make that data work, and that work should be how you analyze it and how you process it, how it shapes your thinking, and how it can also help to improve your bottom line, be it, if you're in sales or if you're trying to improve health outcomes for your patients. So that's the point I'm trying to make here. Data in itself is just an asset, right? And information is different. So information, for you to move from making data being useful, you have to go through that point where it transformed into information, and then the decision is made based on the information. So you can have data without information, but you cannot have information without data. It's as simple as that. So until data is transformed, it's just there, idle. It's like what we say in finance. I've forgotten the right word, but that asset is idle. Basically, you have to utilize it for you to get the benefits from it, and that benefit is how it informs your decision, and the decision that hits your bottom line. Now, I'm taking us again back to the basics. So I've talked about data. I've talked about what the attributes of data-driven organizations are. Now I'm going to talk about culture, right? Culture, as we say, so when we talk about Nigeria, we have different cultures, we have different peoples from different parts of the country. We talk about Africans as well. We have West Africans with different regions. Then when you bring it up to the national level, you bring it to international level, you would say, how do we compare the way of life, the culture of people, say, in Nigeria compared to the culture of, say, people in Ghana, or culture of people in the UK? There's something that is very, very common, as anthropologists would say. But I want us to look at culture here in the context that Jed Husty, by the way, this is an author that I do follow strongly. He's done quite a lot of work bringing anthropology with data and also with decision making and strategy, right? And we're looking at culture here as a collective phenomenon. So if you take a collective people, right, either the way they do things, either by they work in the same organization, or they actually interact together, or they don't even interact together, but they have something in common, maybe because they are all in the same sector. That is the perspective we're coming from. So think about you, your organization, or think about you as a Nigerian, right? Culture here is just simply looking at the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes one people or one category of people from another. But culture is learned, and it derives from my environment. So I'm going to be talking about data and data-driven culture from the context of where we are as a country. Do we use data, to inform our decision making? If not, why? Are there areas where good practice of using data? Are there areas where we can improve? Because if you think about it and you're comparing our culture with the cultures of other organizations or other countries, and how it informs, say, their politics, it informs, say, their how they make their policies, how their environments are built, a lot of that is driven by the collective mindset of the people, right? That they want to improve and they're holding people accountable. Now, we're starting from a low base. That culture is not really embedded in our system. We're getting there, and this talk here is to help us to actually drive towards doing that, starting individual by individual, groups by groups, and then transforming also organizations by organizations as a building block to a better place where we can make informed decision making, right? The next slide here, I'll be talking about what is then data culture. So we've talked about data, we've talked about what data-driven attributes of organizations are, and then we talked about culture as a concept on its own. But then what's data culture? So it's bringing those two things together. Is that mindset? So as an organization, how do you make decisions, right? Is it data-driven? Is it by facts? Or is it a 50-50? Right? Or is it just gut feel, right? So, but data culture and that mindset, can be, you have three building blocks in there, or key factors or characteristics, I'll call them. Is it accessible? If the data exists, can it be accessible? Is it open? Does it reflect a collaboration across systems? So if you are working in an organization or in a business and you have different parts of the business, say you have sales, you have the people who actually do the fulfillment or the production in the system. At each point when the product moves in the processes all the way to the customer, it moves from one point to another. There's a transfer of information and data is collected, and you know what that means in terms of the bottom line. Is that data open? Is it connected? Do I know when the production people are ready to, if they say this product is going to take 3 days to complete, and I take an order and telling the customer that in 3 days you're going to get this product. Is that information, of understanding the service level agreements? Is it consistent? Is it useful? Are we all coordinated and well oiled? That's simply what it's saying here. So, and do we have an evidence-based mindset where we use data, even when things go wrong, we can go back to data, and then that data will help us to improve our processes. That is data culture. If you don't do that, then you need to rethink your processes and why you should be, embed data culture. Now, you have trying to build a data culture in your system or an organization, but data, like I mentioned, until it's been transformed, then it's not useful. It's not useful to anyone. But data has to be very relevant and it has to add value. And what does that mean? Data has to be right. It has to be accurate. It has to be timely. So if I need to have data today to make a decision, I can't wait until tomorrow. If that data is not available today, then it's of no use to me, right? So, and if that data is that of good quality? Does it exist? How is it processed? So I did talk about the super eagles, for example. So if someone pulls the data and he says, look, these are all the teams or the performance of the super eagles over the last 20, 30 years, and they've qualified for the World Cup or they qualified for the Nations Cup, and I can say their performance is wobbly or it's been poor. If at any point in time someone doctors that data, right, and doesn't put the right information in there, it's going to put the Super Eagles performance in a better light or in a more deteriorating light compared to what really it is. So so the quality of your data is also very, very important. And yes, it's given that there may be times when your data may not be fully complete because maybe you're starting from a lower base, but what assumptions are you making in that data to say, okay, I'm going for a sample of 100 out of a possible 1,000. Have I captured majority of the people or the cohort within that data that would tell me or give me the accurate picture of the performance of that system? That is assumptions. So you need to make your assumptions right. And if you need to have a focus group of experts, they need to also be able to add value or some management insight into that data for it to be very, very helpful. So relevance of data and value of data is very, very key to any suggestions to improve operational efficiency. So what role does data play in decision making? So there are four cardinal areas here that we have to look at. So we've looked at data as an asset already. We've looked at the importance of data to inform decision making. But then the parts in between that would transform that data into information for decision making is the data analysis. So how you transform that data, what tools you use, for example, and then the why. Why are you doing this? Are you doing it because you want to, to improve your systems, or are you doing it? Of course, if you're improving your systems, it's going to add to your bottom line. But you have to continuously use data to inform your decision making, because data will help you to improve. So you may have grown your customer base from 5 to 10 or to 20 today. Without data, you wouldn't know the possibility that you could actually increase your customer base by 100-fold. So that's another value of data, which I just need to call out here. So if you're a data-driven organization, you think about it from four perspectives. Look at data as an asset. How is data being processed? How is it being processed to inform decision-making? And is it continuously helping you to improve your systems and your processes? I want to quickly do a poll here with you guys on the call. Just give me a moment. Let me kick off this technology, and I hope it works. So just give me a moment. Before I go any further, I just want to test to see where we are all coming from in terms of our experience and the use of data. Apologies, it's taking ages for this to read. Okay. So this is me using a technology that exists, and I'm going to bring to life the power of using data, using you all on the call as guinea pigs, not guinea pigs in the literal sense, but you are going to be participating in this. So shortly you're going to see like a questionnaire popping up on the screen, but I want you to follow the URL. Go to mentimeter.com, and there's a code that you're going to see on the screen. When you go in there, you enter that code, and that code would bring like a poll onto your device, so you can use your phone to do this, or you can use a second device to do this. So you go to mentimeter.com or menti.com and just enter that code 79530971, and you start to see, a set of, questions or a poll, and just respond to those questions. And what you notice in real time on the screen is the results will start to show. And I'll show you the results as we progress. But scan this and then let me know what you can see.
John, could you put the code in the chat again?
Okay, so I'll put it in the chat. So this is the first question. You see, 7, 0. Ibrahim, I think there's some people on on the call? Seven 79530971. Can we all see it? So I've got 5 people who have responded on this question. So the next question, you'll see. So if you're on this call, it'll be helpful, just let me know what best describes your profession or your discipline. Okay, just move very quickly. What's one thing you would like to, you hope to take away from this event? Just free text. Just give a minute. Right, I'll go to the next one. Hopefully, I think it should be the last one. So we're talking about data. How good is your experience with this topic? Are you new to it? You got reasonably good experience, or you're actually, sort of an expert? Okay, so got some experts here. So there's a good balance, at least from the people who have responded. Right. So which of these areas would you want to focus on mostly today? And by the way, ideally, this would have been if we knew, we had a preset class and we knew the people who are coming in, we would ask you these questions. But most of the areas that are here will be covered, but it would be good to just have an idea of where people's interests are. And then you can use this information at the end, to really measure the quality of what's been delivered as well. So strategic planning and a lot of that. Cool. So thank you very much for that. And I'll just go back to the presentation. Yeah. Can you still see the presentation, Ibrahim? Everyone? Good. Thank you. So what you've just seen there is a classic example, of, using data, right? So the first question I did ask you there is about how you use data for decision making, right? And for this program and the discussions we're having is basically just trying to test to see how embedded we have data in decisions that we make. But the reality is that in life, we do process data to inform our decision making without even realizing, right? So before you step out of the house, and let's say you normally take a route, or you've got 3 routes that you normally take to go to work, and there's traffic, and you're traveling, say, between coming from Barnawa and you're heading into Kaduna in the main metropolis, or you're coming from one part of Abuja, you're going to the central area district. You do know the hotspots where the traffic jam usually happens, and at a certain point in time. So many of you here will relate to the fact that you usually say, oh, I'm leaving. If I need to get to the office for 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, I will need to avoid this route or that route. That is you using data without you even realizing you're using data. Most of us have devices today, that tracks number of steps and tells us our heart rate, our heartbeat. That's you using data. That's you collecting data, basically. But the value of that is simply, what then do you use that data for? If you keep stepping on the scale and the scale gives you 75 kg, 80 kg, and your BMI is quite extensive and you need to reduce your weight and do something about it, that's data you've collected. But have you used it? The only way you can see the value of it is when you apply that data to now say, okay, well, I need to start doing some exercises. I need to start eating well and prepare my diet. So that is, in practical terms, how we use data. But here, what we're trying to do here is to try to see how do we build that culture where we can elevate the use of data to core areas of decision making, areas that would apply and would affect people's lives. Either farmers, either healthcare providers, even our policymakers, or even holding our public service holders to account. So this is the whole essence of why we're doing this and why we're having these conversations. So we're moving away from just using judgmental, approaches to decision making and using data to actually how we can use facts. And using facts, you have to use some analysis. Now, let's think about problems. We live in a world where there's a lot of uncertainty, right? We may come from different cultures, and we look at, when I say different cultures, what obtains in Nigeria, in Africa, to projections to what happens internationally. Different cultures, but sometimes we do have the same problems. So climate change is the same problem for everyone across the world, ecological disasters and the likes, and the threat of the earth warming and the impact on livelihoods, right? Across. So different cultures, we have the same problems. But we do also have other types of problems, and the nature of the problems will be determined by, or the nature of your problems will determine how much of the data you need. In some cases, it might not be too much data. In other cases, you may need to use data and additional insight also to help solve your problems. So if you think about it, if your problem is very rational, the example I gave, you just want to move from point A to point B, you want to avoid traffic, yep, data can help you because you can tell that at time A or time 7 a.m. every morning, there's usually traffic on this route. I will avoid this route. So you know that data is there, it's rational thinking. But then there are instances where, decisions and problems are by nature, emotional, right? So data alone would not solve that. You would have to use data with a combination of other methods. And then, of course, when you get into sort of the political environment where there's a lot of uncertainty, the complexities around, ethnicity, there's diversity, there's also issues like, for some people, the problem is financial, others economic, others social, and all that. Then you have to make a very difficult decision, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So you hear the word VUCA because it's quite volatile, the velocity is there, is uncertain, it's very complex. Right? So this is where I will now introduce operational research. And on operational research, it's very apt because operational research has a range of tools, both soft and also hard tools, where you use rational thinking, and you can also have tools that are soft in nature that will help you to understand the complexities in the world. Now, I won't go into too much detail on the slide, but you can research this after this, and we'll send you the slides. But operational research started as a discipline during the Second World War. So you can see where the Western culture and civilization there have used conflict, they've used wars to actually improve and come up with methods, scientific methods, and using data inclusive to improve. So today, most of the solutions that you see in business, most of them were actually coined from either exploration to Mars, or even during sorry, I say exploration to Mars, exploration to the moon, or during the Second World War. So this is where operational research started. And with this, there's so many tools that you can actually use. And the approach in operational research is how to, first of all, define the problem. So you have a problem, you need to understand the landscape, right? You need to then understand, okay, well, there are gaps in here and I need some data. Then you collect the data, you validate the data, you apply the data into a conceptual model that you developed, and then you would make informed decisions about it. And the cycle continues because you're constantly refining. So you're collecting some data, but you're constantly refining the data. So today you've collected the data, it tells you about your system. You understand that your customers, mostly from your business, come from one part of Abuja, in Lube, for example. But you understand that I need to collect data from Karshi, for example, and from Karshi, I will understand that there are more customers that I can gain from that area. So then you refine your model, your conceptual model, and you continue to improve on that until you start to expand your customer base and you can reach out to more customers. That is the concept here that I want us to understand from data. I won't go into too much detail here. For those of you who say you understand data, you understand the complexities of science, and you've done engineering math, for example, these terms here are fairly familiar to you. So stochastic modeling, optimization, would be up there. But I just want to touch here the next slide, which is to bring it to life a bit. Because when we talk about data, and I want to also bring in the concept of AI on the other side here is, for data to be applied or to be utilized and processed to make sense to us for decision making, there are many things that you have to look at from the data. So what are you trying to get the value you're trying to get from the data? Do you simply want to understand the system, basically? So you want to learn about the complex interactions. So I'll be using an example later, looking at the agricultural sector, the, say, fish farming community, right? So you want to understand the fish farming value sector. So you want to understand who is producing the seedlings. You want to understand who is actually consuming, who is actually providing, bio technical, or services, or who's providing certain equipment, or who is even the regulator. That's you trying to understand what is going on, in that area, right? And why there's an issue. You may also want to interrogate the data because you want to understand what is likely to happen if I combine the data in different ways. How do I predict what's going to happen in the future? So if I have a customer base in Abuja and I want to go into a market in Benue, for example, can I use the information that I understand from Abuja to make some prediction of how my conceptual model will work if I need to go into Benue? Of course, I need to adjust for the factors in Benue for my customer base. So that's prediction. So you hear things like regression analysis, linear regression, and the likes. That's you moving into that space. And predictive analytics is what actually starts to form into some of the conversations when you have about big data, and we start to move into sort of the AI space, and we're doing real-time analysis and predictions of what's going to happen. And a lot of that also is being utilized in your meteorological services to understand weather patterns, to predict what's the weather going to be like in the next 2 days based on what we know now. So there's a lot of assumptions that needs to be made into that sort of analysis as well. Now, you may also just want to understand, what the data is, or if I adjust a factor, if I want to maybe looking at as a financial service, I want to lend to people, and there are different classes of people, those who you lend to who are bad customers that will default, or those who will not default. So you can also look at that from the problem analysis point of view, or you just want to explore the data. So like I said earlier, you started by saying the Super Eagles haven't performed. I need to know what's going on with this team. How are we even managing football? Let's go back and look at the data of how the team has been performing over the last 20, 30 years in terms of qualifications for the World Cup. So you may just pull that data and you want to really understand what's going on, right? And then you can say, look, okay, maybe we need to change the way we recruit, or we need to focus on how we do the coaching, or we need to just forget about qualifying for the next 4 years and focus on, starting all over again in terms of our strategy as a national team. It could be that simple. So these are methods that you can use, and we can go through each method, at a later time. But the focus of this talk today is just to give you a flavor of what data use is and how it can be used for informed decision making. So again, like I said previously, many of us here are from different backgrounds. We have people from legal, from finance, from engineering, from construction, architecture. But the reality is that operational research and data, for example, are applicable to many applications. So we may be utilizing operational research, but we don't know. If I'm doing quality improvement in my job, I'm applying OR. That's an operational research method. If I'm, simply maybe reviewing, doing strategy, doing some financial analysis, I'm reviewing, optimizing, using Lean Six Sigma, for quality improvement, things like that. That's operational research, right? If I'm doing conflict resolution analysis because I'm in the defense and industry sector, that's operational research. So there are many applications of OR to, in what we do daily. Now, I will go into, just looking at how we can build and sustain a data-driven culture. And then lastly, I'll use maybe the next 5 minutes just to bring to life, how data, and OR were brought together in a real life scenario in Nigeria to inform policy making. So it brings it to life, all the technical stuff that I've covered up to this point. So if you're thinking about, data, and you say, look, from the start, we said, what is a data-driven organization? Am I data-driven? To what extent do I use data to inform decision making? And you have gaps in there. Well, we know in our environment in Nigeria, it's not very common. We're trying to build that culture of using data. But there are many things that you also have to think about in terms of, if you want to start from the scratch or you want to enhance your current processes. So there are a few considerations here. So think about it. What's your vision? If you don't have data yet, so how do I start to build that data? It could be as simple as pulling out a spreadsheet and start to record your customers if you're set into buying and selling, for example, right? Okay, if you already have that and you know your customers, right? Okay, you collect that data in a way, in a spreadsheet. Okay, is it really efficient? And how can I use it in a continuous way that when my customer base starts to expand, I can have a very good infrastructure that would allow me to easily pull that data, utilize it, or even enhance that data, right? So you have to think about it. And then if I need to share that data, I need to also start thinking about the governance, the standards. What kind of standards do I have, in my data? Can I, is there a standard way of entering customers by demographics, by age, by different areas? Can I start to really expand that data from my own locality to other localities? How would that be reflected in the database, right? And then also, in terms of storage, how then, okay, well, I'm using Excel just now. Excel is limited. The data can get too big and I can't start sharing spreadsheets around. Do I need to start thinking about the cloud? Okay, what's the securities involved in that? Can I build dashboards? Can I get insights in real time? These are all things to think about, in that sort of data ecosystem and data, life cycle. Now, in terms of also your strategies and capabilities, you need to understand also that if I'm actually, operating in an environment that is highly regulated, i.e. in finance, for example, or if I'm in the airline industry and everything there is also controlled and I need to submit data of my flight schedules, of how I treat customers, how customers experience our services, how is that data going to be shared with them? And is it following the standards? So there's a lot to think about from there. But what we do in Valu8 is we can actually help you to walk through this from the minutiae, if you're a small business, to even when you're in a complex system and you need to really make sure that you are able to set up your structures. And like I mentioned, the psychological safety of data is very important. If I'm providing data as a customer to you or you're collecting my data, is it following the sort of data protection, rules that we have, the GDPR rules. If we're using the data within the organization that we operate in, how collaboratively do we work and how do we share that data? Information security is also very important, and the privacy of the individuals who are affected. So if I'm going to collect data, am I collecting data that is just pertinent to what I'm trying to do, not collecting data just for the sake of collecting? So if I don't need your age, I don't need where you come from, why should I collect data about that? So all these things need to also be taken into account. This is where we then move into literacy. So if you notice previously when we talked about data-driven culture, and we talked about the attributes of a data-driven organization, literacy featured in that. So how literate are you about data? So in the poll that we did previously, a few people did say they are kind of in the middle, they understand data. Some said we're just starting from scratch, and there are a few maybe experts around. But fundamentally, we need to learn, right? Our educational system, the literacy level is very, very important, because the human mind is our fundamental resource. It needs to be fueled, it needs to be worked on, it needs to be improved. Remember, again, we talked about culture from the concept of the mindset, right, of a people of a particular area. So we in Nigeria, we're not used to using data for decision making. How can we build ourselves up to that level where using data and evidence just becomes the norm? It requires literacy and a certain level of literacy. The data I'm going to show you here is simply, I need to update this. This was going back, I think was last year or so, thereabouts. But here are the top three future jobs based on, I think it was the World Economic Forum research, right? Which was published. And by just looking at the top 10 there, you can see where analytical thinking was up there and still remains so in 2020, but it's expected to remain that 2027. But in 2027, we're also expecting AI and big data, right? But then there's also leadership, social influence, and other sort of soft skills. But you can see clearly in there, anything that involves critical thinking, creative design and thinking requires data. Data and technology are sort of underpinning that. So these are very, very, very relevant. I'm sure if you look at the latest report, you see that as well. Thinking about it here, you may think your job, what was your job? What do you do in your current job? You may not be using data, but there are jobs that actually are fast on the decline, and there are jobs that are growing. But most of the jobs that are on that sort of growth pedestal actually are driven by data. So even if you're a medical doctor, because robotics is now in medicine, there's robotic medicine, there's medical sciences, with technology, you have to understand data. You may not be utilizing the data, but data will be sitting behind driving how you operate and how you function. So this is very, very important as well. So it's just to highlight the importance of data in what we do currently and what we might be doing in the future and what it means for us. So if we want to retrain, we may have to think about, how we and which areas we need to focus on to retrain. So I would jump out of this slide and just give you a brief example of where where I use data as an organization to inform decision making, which is here in this case was policy making for a project that was funded by the United States Development Agency, which has been scrapped now, I think, by the US, but it was called USAID. So I would take the next 3 minutes and I'll go, and apologies, I'm just going to rattle through this, but I hope you get the gist of this. So what you're going to get from this is the what we did and why we did it, right? And from there also you see how data was being utilized. So this is about aquaculture, fish farming, right? So if you eat fish today, there's every chance that either that fish was caught somewhere in the fresh water in Nigeria, or it was actually farmed somewhere, right? So it may be farmed there in Abuja, it may have come from Minna, Niger State, or it might have come from Borgu, somewhere in New Busa. So I'm talking about Niger State in here. So a scoping study was done, and the government, in collaboration with the United States Development Agency, thought about what are all the issues here around how can we make improve the livelihoods of people who are into small, medium scale farming, especially aquaculture in Niger State? And how does that connect with other systems? And how can we help people actually develop, that sector, and also help the state to develop that sector? So that's where I come in. So I came into this conversation and with the state, and we got a lot of people, key stakeholders, all together. And one thing I readily realized was that, yes, we understood the problem statement, but data does not exist. And where data exists, that data is not structured, and that data is not useful, right? I can see Professor Ndaiji is coming onto this call, so he was also part of this work that we did. Now, the people said, well, we want to see a Niger State aquaculture. And I also think about this from the sectors we play, not just about fish farming, but you may be in health, right? What is your vision? You have to start from the vision, the strategy. What are you trying to achieve before you start thinking about whether you have data about it? So these were a few things, producers had a view, processors had a view, the government as a regulator had a view, right? And consumers, food safety. Do you know what fish you're eating? The quality. Do you know how dangerous? Maybe it might have other impediments, or you may have chemicals in it. We don't know that because we don't have data. We don't collect data. We don't make decisions using data. So what we decided to do here was to understand, first of all, where the gaps are. And I'll just, like I said, rattle quickly. The reality at the national context is we import fish more than actually we're producing. And it's still a gap, and we're still expecting that gap to widen because we're doing nothing about it, right? But if we need to improve on our production locally, then we need to understand how that sector operates. Do we know all the producers? Or if I ask you now, do you know how many people are producing fish in your area or even your state locality where you live? We don't, right? So that's one thing. And what we decided to do was to now go beneath that to understand the gaps, and then to really start to move up from there. So we knew the challenges. Like I said, there's no data. There's issues with domestic supply. We don't have technology applied in our sector. There's access to finance is also a problem, and all a raft of issues in there. But guess what? We start with the people. We had all the stakeholders in the room, and we discussed about this because the policy making is about the ground up. And this is where you start to see the power of data, because you're collecting information from individuals and you're sharing the information you've collected and you're playing it back to them to validate what that information is. But at the same time, you have to understand who are the people. Do you have everybody in the room? So we had to understand their level of interest and their level of influence. That's where the stakeholder analysis comes in. So this is me bringing in data and operational research into play. And what's the end goal? To inform a decision making. And what is the outcome? We want to make an impact. And what's that impact? We want to improve the livelihood of the average citizen in Niger State who is into fish farming, the average citizen who consumes fish, so that he or she knows what they're consuming, and for the government to understand the landscape of that sector so that they know how to govern the landscape to improve the lot and improve the livelihoods of the people as a business. So if you're going to fish farming, you know it's going to be a profitable business for you. So a lot of information had to be collected, but like I said, we had to understand the information from the perspective of the seed producers, the fish producers, the processors, the consumers, all the way through to even the potential for exports and all that. So a lot of information data was being collected from a sample of fish farmers. And without going into too much, I would just give you an overview of what that data told us. Right. So one thing we gathered was that a lot of the farmers or the fish farmers were quite young in age in terms of, their experience working there. So that was one. We also understood that when you split the information that we collected, by males versus female, this was what you're getting. Majority of the producers were male. Women were not really into fish production. But if we start to collect the data by maybe processing and the likes, we may get a different picture of that. But this was the initial information to make us understand what's going on within aquaculture so that we could come up with a policy that was most effective, and then we can start to collect that data on a regular basis, which is where we're going. So for you to become a data-driven organization, you're not collecting data here and now. It has to be continuous, because that's the only way you can understand if your process or your system is actually improving day by day, month by month, quarter by quarter, and also year by year. So we had to understand that data from several perspectives. We had to understand the data from what were people doing when they're producing. Were they producing for the table market, which is for people to consume, or were they producing to restock for others? So maybe I'm buying that fish at 5 months or 3 months because I want to stock up for my own production. Maybe that was it. So this was the data we collected. And we also had to understand how people were producing. Were they using earthen dams? Were they using concrete? What sort of production systems were they using? So all that sort of insight helped us to really understand the landscape of the aquaculture sector, and importantly, to understand what were their pain points. And most of them did complain that the pricing of fish feeds was very, very important and was constituted the bulk of the cost of their production system. And also, we did understand that the value of aquaculture to Niger State was quite in the billions in terms of revenue, right? So there's a lot of potential in there for the state. So here is just a nutshell of just to describe to you what, how we collected data and how that data informed the policy making for Niger State. So the policy is out there. It's quite fresh. It's been signed off by the government, but it's just a question of implementation, which is usually the next steps and the challenge for us. So I'm just going to wrap up now, because this slides, forthcoming slides here, again, you guys are going to get all the slides. Ibrahim is going to share them with you, but these are all technical stuff that you can always go back to. So the point I'm making here is, data is quite very, very important for us in decision making. If we want to improve systems, if we need to measure something, or we need to get things get done, then we have to have data, because what gets measured gets done. If I'm not being assessed by my performance and knowing how I've progressed over the last couple of weeks, over the last couple of years, I will not develop, and I will not get a fair assessment of what is attributable to me. If we need to understand how to improve the lot of our super eagles, I'll come back to that example analogy again. We have to go back and understand the ecosystem of our football, and we need to use data. We need to use judgment. We need to use the right people. We need to collect data that is timely, so that we can assess the system to come up with strategies that will help us to improve our lot. So to improve your situation, you have to consider, do you want to stay in the small gold pond, or do you want to move into a bigger bowl, which has the capacity to take you on as you continue to grow? Because you as a business, you as an organization, your ultimate goal is to grow and to become more profitable. So staying in a small bowl will not be sufficient. So you have to move into a big bowl. For you to do that, think about data, think about how you make decisions, and the rest will be history. Thank you very much, and apologies for going over the time. Thank you, Brian. Happy for questions.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the presentation. We do appreciate the insight. First question, you said the value run into billions. How many billions are we talking about?
Yeah, so again, this was data going back to 2022. And like I said, it was a sample. So it was a sample of about 200 farms. But what we did, we used technology and people on the ground, and we captured, I think, majority of the big farms that you call commercially viable farms, right? So, and from that data, we're talking about 3 billion in revenue. And I also want to put a word of caution here. We didn't even get the bulk of the production, the bigger farms that were in Borgu, in Niger State, in New Busa, because there was, of course, the banditry prevented us from going there to collect data. So in terms of revenue alone, you're talking of a sector that is billions. And again, there may be other small, Mama Waidi or Hajia, Barrow, or somebody who is doing something in a plot of land behind their house. That also means we've not captured 100%. So the only way you can get a good sense of the value of the fish farming, say in Niger State or anywhere, is you have to have 100% sample. Most developed countries do 100% sample of their producers. So why can't we do the same?
Thank you. So 3 billion as at 2022, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's an estimate. Yeah.
An estimate. Okay, thank you very much. The floor is open. You can unmute or raise your hand to speak and ask John your questions. Please proceed. And if you want a copy of this presentation, please leave your email in the chat box for capturing. If you do have a question, just unmute and speak or raise your hand. Thank you. So while we're waiting for more people to step up, the other question would be to ask, what was the outcome of the information you presented to after your findings? How did it change anything, or what did it change, if anything at all?
Yeah. So so when it comes to so with the so like I said, there was no policy to start with, right? Which would tell you, how the sector operates and to come up with any improvement to even help the government to actually say, this is our vision and this is how we can actually realize our vision, right? So what that data did was it helped with the engagement, because like I said also, and again, due to lack of time, the policy-making process was actually from the ground up. It wasn't developed sitting in a cold room, quiet room by some top government officials with maybe me as a consultant and other people. We did it together with the stakeholders, people from across different agencies within the government, standard organization, NAFDAC, researchers in FUT, the producers themselves, and everyone who actually is involved in the ecosystem about fish farming or interest even in environment, in health, education, everything. Everyone was in the same room. So we collected that data before because the data allowed us to really understand what was going on in the landscape and allowed us to map the information we had from various researches or what was going on at the national context. Because remember, we're import dependent. We're importing more fish. So why are we importing fish? Is it the pricing? Is it cheaper when you go to the market? And this is what the data was telling us about the sector. And then when we went into the room to start talking about the sector, to understand the issues, to develop the policy, we had the data right in front of us. So it allowed us to engage and allowed the stakeholders to understand and then to say, oh, that data actually makes sense. Okay, have you taken X and Y into account? Okay, how can we make it better? Or, okay, you need to take into account that. And then it helped to inform even the estimation that we had, even that 3 billion value that I was talking to you about. It all came from that conversation. But ultimately, the impact of that was that we ended up with a policy. And that policy sets out the areas of responsibilities of the government and areas for responsibilities for the stakeholders and how all of them can actually come together. So we came up with key themes like, okay, this is what it means, when we talk about improving access to finance, we need to have the banks, we need to have record keeping for the stakeholders, for the farmers, so that it's easier to actually present your farm performance to the banks to lend, because the bank will not lend to you without data. It's as simple as that. But many farmers don't keep records. So that's one area of immediate impact. The second area also is about, okay, talking about improved seedlings and access to feeds. So feeds constitute over 80% for some, majority on average, to the cost of production for fish, right? And that influences the price that you get, you as a consumer. So the question then was, can we have alternatives for feeds? Can we use dragon fly, for example? And I think Professor Gabriel, I'll call it my sidekick, and support technical on this project, he was already doing some research around that. So that also helped to alleviate the point of, do we need to invest in research? So we come up with alternatives that will reduce the cost of feeds, and that will reduce the cost of production, and also talk about regulation as well. So there were many aspects to the policy which are there, and the policies, it's not just policy in statements, it's policy also with operational plans. So if you want to implement that policy across each theme of the sector, we can go into each theme as private sector individuals and lift it up. So that's what I can say about the impact of what we did in terms of data.
Thanks again. So the floor is open. Kindly raise your hand or just unmute and ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for this very insightful presentation. I think it's really useful on a national scale, and I think also in terms of small and medium businesses, I think there's a lot that can be enhanced in such operations using data-driven methods. Now, my question is, as a country, thinking about Nigeria, do you have any awareness to what extent our policies are data-driven? And if you do, to what extent we can encourage or enhance the use of data-driven methods in policy formulation at a national level, and hopefully in some regard on a small scale level as well, so to encourage small and medium enterprise to pursue such methods in decision making for their businesses.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Yeah, good to see you on the call. So the first question you asked is about to what extent do we use data to inform our decision making. I would say, if you remember, I don't know if you were at the start of the call where we did the poll, where I think we did have a mix of responses from people to what extent they actually use data themselves, right? It's a reflection of, it's not even the 50-50. To be honest, we do a lot of gut feel in our policy making. We don't use data. Or even where we use data, right? We use data very, very patchy. So I'll give you an example. When I picked up that project for the aquaculture, right? And I tried to find data for it, there was really nothing on the Nigerian Bureau for Statistics when it comes to aquaculture. There was some data that would tell you about fish, but it was telling you about maybe riverine fisheries or maybe price of fish, which was good. You could track prices, but for the purpose of what we're trying to do, there was nothing, because there was nothing to tell me of the value or what's going on in the state, for example, right? So that made me then to reflect on, okay, there were several policies on our agricultural policies, which they call the Agricultural Development Program policies, going back to about President Obasanjo's time, I think, when Abu Obe was the Minister of Agriculture. And those policies were published everywhere. But what I did realize was that a lot of those policies, yes, they may have been driven by data to an extent, but they were actually done just for that purpose, collectively within maybe a focus group, but nothing that reflected the realities on the ground, and nothing for you to be able to say, if I want to understand if the sector is improving, do I have a data that will tell me how well it is improving? So for me, if you go back to the attributes of a data-driven organization, it's not just about looking at the data you collect today as an asset, but how well is that data translated to information, and how that information is translated to your decision-making, and how that decision-making then leads to improvement in your system. And then do you have the data that then would tell you how well you're improving? So if you come from that perspective or those attributes, I would say that we are actually from a low base. We're not doing enough in that. We're doing things that are patchy, but there's nothing in there because it's not just part of how we operate. So it's a big gap. And it's not just in one sector, but you can see it in education. You can see it in health, So you may find partners in different sectors, maybe that have been funded by private individuals or international organizations. They would have rich data, even more than we as a country. Because if you do have data, then you're open, you're transparent, and then you allow the facts, and then you hold people accountable. So if someone is not performing in their portfolio, the data is there, and data doesn't lie. So are we holding people to account for lack of performance? If we're not doing that, then I would say that it leaves so much to be desired, and there's a big gap. So we're not doing enough in that respect. For small scale, medium enterprises, what I would say also is that from this example that I gave with Niger State is very, very clear that we have a lot of farmers operating at that level. they're not used to collecting data. Today, if you ask them about how they're performing, they'll tell you, well, I remember last year, this time I sold about 1,000. Even when we were collecting data, that's what you hear. They will make an estimate because they don't keep the records, right? They're living day by day. As money is coming in, they're buying products. But if we come up with mechanisms, technology is there in real time, you can capture data and you can even refresh that data with regular inputs from them, then yeah, it makes it easy. And this is where technology, and then of course, I will not even go into AI because as far as I'm concerned, we haven't even built the infrastructure for us in our system to even get to that culture of using data. So what value is AI going to bring in that respect? So that's something that I just want to say. There's an opportunity for small, medium scale enterprises, but it's bringing that conversation to life for them to understand that, look, there's more benefit for you to gain, and the cost to you today will be minimal. The benefit is greater in the future, but we have to sell it, and the tone has to come from the top, which is, of course, our government and our public policymakers.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive response, because as you were speaking, I was thinking, my next concern, which is not a question really, it's more like a comment, but then you addressed it in your last two sentences, where how, what can be done anthropologically to push the culture of, at the top as well as from the grassroots up in to sensitize people and to encourage people to adapt more data-driven led culture. But like you said, it has to start at the top. And I guess that's a more anthropological question or concern than this session allows for. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Soje.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have some few questions to ask. In your research, I don't know, have you considered environmental factors, poor quality fingerling, post-harvest handling challenges, and again, regulatory and policy gaps? Finally, I want to talk about infrastructure and power challenges. Why I'm asking these questions? At a point, I was a consultant to a fish milling company, is a subsidiary of Flamis of Nigeria. Most big farmers, fish farmers, they come up with their recipe or standard. This is what they want. They want protein level to be this. They want this to be that in percentages. So they ask, it's like customized feed. Okay, customize this feed for me, for my fish. The company will produce that and they deliver to them and they get results. What in this your project, what are your continuous improvement plan? And how can you address some of these questions I've asked?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I'll start by the first question. And again, the second part, because I didn't go into detail I just used key aspects that related to the discussions we're having today about data-driven organizations. I didn't talk about the policy in detail, but I'll tell you that it did cover a range of things. But I'll start with the first question. So yes, the data that we collected, so the policy making and using data was a combination of desk research as well as also data that was collected, hard data about the production sector. Now, the next steps, which is maybe for next piece of work, was the 100% survey, as well as collecting additional data from other value chain actors like processors or even other suppliers and the likes. But yes, we did take into account, everyone in the value chain for fish farming. So you can see on the screen here, and if you're familiar with your sector, you will know that you've got seed producers, feed producers, everybody in there. So the conversation about the whole sector and how we shape the policy took into account the whole value chain. And that's what operational research does for you. Operational research is all about systems thinking. You think about a system, not one part of the system. Because if you think about it as every part coming together to form a system, that final system gives you what no other individual component of the system has. So the seed producers will not have the full comprehension of the full system of value of aquaculture if they sit in isolation. Because if I sell my seeds, can I exist? I have to have a market. I have to have somebody. If the market fails or the market is not efficient, then I don't have a market. I don't have a business. So we took that into account in a lot of the things we did and discussions, as well as the data that informed the policy. We also looked into the correlation, or rather the cohabitation of fish farming and your terrestrial fishermen. So if you go to the Borgu area, for example, you've got the riverine, right? The river, and you've got the fish farmers. So if you go and you site your fish farm somewhere close to the river, and that fish farm, of course, is taking sediments from your continuous production, it seeps through the waterbed and it could seep back into the river and contaminate the river as well, right? So that also was taken into account. If you're also doing fish farming and you're doing fish farming close to the river and maybe inside, maybe one part of the area, like cage fish farming, you're going to go into, there'll be a clash between you and the people who are actually catching fish, because there either be fish escapes and the likes of it. And of course, the environmental impact. If the environment, there was flooding in Niger State, I remember was 2008, I can't remember what year, 2018, that's thereabout, which led to a loss of over 500 million naira worth of fish. So that's an environmental impact, because there was an overflow that happened, and the river would always find its route, even if it's dry. So that happened. Many people had built their fish farms on the old riverbed, which was good. It was nice. They were making money, but then the floods came. So a lot of those information were baked into what we did. And then the policy came up with policy areas here that I will just flash it on the screen here, where we looked at, these were the final policies. So it does capture everything. So there was improving the value chain. There was, quality of the fish. There was the improvement of the systems for the aquaculture for planning. There's the access to finance. And then there's the governance and the partnerships involved as well. And under each of these themes, there were policy objectives and there were desired outcomes. And under the desired outcomes, there were operational plans for each one of them to measure the continuous improvement across those areas. So like I said, again, it's one thing to develop a policy, an operational plan, and present it to the government. Is the next thing is left also there is for the government to actually, say, yes, we actually are interested in doing this, and we want to promote this because it's valuable to our people, and we want to see the impact of this on our people and the impact of this on our performance. But you and I both know that because our public sector workers are not, or politicians are not really assessed by values, issue-based politics or the data, then it doesn't really matter for them. So even if the sector is struggling today, nobody knows if it's struggling. Does it really matter? And is it going to impact on the electability of the public officials? That's another question for another day. But in terms of tracking the improvement and the performance of the sector, I would say nothing has been done, because we haven't even kicked off the implementation of this policy, which is what we've been chasing for years now. Ibrahim, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
So I've put in a link on the chat in there, and just for the sake of time, you can follow that link. It will be, I will appreciate, if you're able to give us some feedback, basically, on this program, how useful it's been, because I know, working in partnership with Future View, Ibrahim holding the affairs here, we want to make sure that we're really adding value through some of our discussions on the masterclass. So any sort of feedback, that will help us to improve on the points. And if you want to go into a deeper dive of what we talked about into some of the areas, or you want to work alongside us to improve how you can use data to inform your decision-making processes, or to talk to you or your organization a little bit more, then we're more than happy to be involved. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, John. Do we have any more questions? All right, so if we don't, John, could you shed a little light on where you see the future of data working in Nigeria going? Because we have a lot of, in fact, we do have an organization called Data Science Nigeria, but I think their primary focus is more on generative data regarding to AI and other things. I'm not sure if they are covering the policy angle. Are you aware of any concerted push for a data-driven policy initiative? And if you're not, what do you think?
I would say the initiative that I'm familiar with, and by the way, I'm even running late for that particular class just now, is the School of Public Policy and Governance, SPPG, which is founded by Dr. Obi Ezekwesili. So it's a movement. That's the only organization where I can see the connection between what they're trying to do in terms of looking at the problem statement in the country, where a lot of our challenges are because we don't have leadership, right? And we're not holding those in leadership accountable. But for us to be able to hold them to account, we need to understand those systems. And for us to understand those systems, we need to have data, right? So that's the only organization where I can see the link between how data is being collected, how data is being utilized to inform the public discourse and to result to meaningful impact. Other areas that you mentioned, like the data science and the likes, all I see them are organizations working in silo because they're not connected. That's my view anyway. Because I look back at when my journey started within the data space, and I first touched ground in 2009, and I was speaking to colleagues, professional colleagues, and I did say, I was talking about data at the time. And someone did mention to me, says, oh boy, this one way they talk and a big grammar, you no go work for this place. So, you know, but that was the reality. But the truth was at that point, it wasn't feasible. One, we didn't even have the infrastructure. You had mobile phones, but there was no accessibility to internet, for example, right? So if you go back to the attributes of a data-driven organization, the infrastructure wasn't even there. Now, what's happened since is data is now a common language, which is a good thing. We're getting there. People are talking about data. And you can see people actively now even engaging and people brandishing data and say, oh, no, the data you're putting there is wrong. It's not correct. It's the one for 2 years ago. It's good. We're talking. But what we need to do next in terms of the journey is how do we embed this in our DNA as a people, as systems, starting from our small locality, even if it's my small street estate, right? And then you can start to hold people to account. You can start to see how your system is operating. Because if you don't measure it, how would you know how to improve it? So I see organizations working in silos. You know, we hold a lot of data. A lot of it is even unstructured. So yes, AI can come in, can help you clean the data. So if your organization is looking at how best to clean data, good and fine. But we need to move and transcend to that point where how do we make it useful? Otherwise, it sits as an asset. Like, you know, data on its own is an asset until it's translated to information and it makes an impact, then it remains an asset and it's not useful to anyone. So I think that's what we need to move to. I don't know if that answers the question, Brian.
Yes, it does, actually, quite nicely. Then in terms of other sectors, I know you're versed in modern agriculture. What other lessons can be learned, for instance, in healthcare or even in day-to-day running of government? What's your view on data going forward for these sectors? I was in Garki Hospital, and they have a nice setup, but I went to the Federal Medical Center here in Abuja. And I was, as an aside, inquiring with Minka, who had the other session, that are all the federal medical centers connected? And she answered in the negative, that just the federal medical centers in Nigeria don't have a common pool from where they assess the data from. So is there a way out? That's part A. Part B is for anybody looking to get into the data science business, not learning now. You want to get into the business of data science. What is your advice?
Okay, I'll use our experience, as a small consultant, and we're trying to build our skills, starting with the literacy and building capacity, because you need partners, right? Because in every sector. But apologies, I hate to use this, benchmarking with Western, systems, but that's the system in which I live in, and that is where we have good standards, or we should be benchmarking basically in the act of what is good and works. So if I look at health, health, there's an opportunity there where, we can start small, which is what's happening, like the example you gave, collecting data from that hospital. But you need to then pilot that and push that across the sector. So if you are operating in the FCT, it would have been really ideal in the same way that we've done this for aquaculture in a state. The next step we're looking for is to get the adoption of the state to give us the access to then do 100% survey. You could do that. That's what you need. You need the government. I know we keep talking about government is not in the business of doing business, but government, of course, creates the enabling environment, because government should I say, sits at the top and organizes everyone, right? So you need to get the buy-in. So if the government, say in FCT, decides and says, yeah, we understand why this is important, and it aligns with our vision, then they can allow for a rollout. That means that every hospital is mandated to provide that information. The government can actually be the custodian of that data. The data then can be consumed by every hospital, so you know how they're performing. You can do a benchmarking. And then, of course, you can then start to move into other areas like clinical performance, healthcare safety, and also quality assurance. But until we get to that point, then it's going to be very, very frustrating to actually make meaningful sense of it. It will just be that, oh, within my hospital, I've collected this data, I understand my own patients and the value I'm adding to the patients. But what that means for the wider system is nothing if it's not all coordinated and collected consistently. And I would say that yes, it may be different sectors, but I think the challenge is across many sectors, not just health, agriculture, education. There are use cases for this approach of ingraining the data culture. And then when it comes to the data business side of things that you mentioned, yes, there's an opportunity for everyone to come in. So if you understand the ecosystem of the data, from collection to analysis, processing, management, to then decision-making and end users and the impact, everyone has a role to play. But what I see here is that, we're still operating in silos, and people just collect data for the sake of it, or for their use at the point, and then it sits in isolation. There's no next steps, and there's no connectivity even within sectors themselves. So somebody has to coordinate, and I don't know for the life of me here, maybe the NIDA, because they seem to be the oversight sector, government parastatal under the NCC, that should be leading on this. So it has to be a joint approach rather than sort of isolated fanfares, to score points and get into that sort of, this is the trend of, we're talking AI, you're talking data science, but the building blocks are very, very important. And the careers even that you can build, on the back of data are quite numerous as well.